It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received, for good or evil, in the superlative degree of comparison only. I'm sure you recognize this as the opening paragraph of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities, because it's probably among Dickens' most quoted passages. But it's also a very accurate description of the 19th century, which is what we will be looking at starting with this video. We'll be talking about the Victorian period, a period running from 1832 to 1901. We'll talk later about why those dates are important. And it's an appropriate introduction because of the 19th century, anything you claim about the century, its opposite is also true. It is the best of times in many ways for England, for the empire, for the middle and upper classes, and the worst of times for the poor. In fact, British novelist and Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli described it in his novel Sybil as the two nations. And the two nations are the rich and the poor who live in very, very different kinds of worlds in the 19th century. It's a period of tremendous social stability, a period of artistic development, but it's also a period of incredible poverty, of incredible suffering for those people who are among the have-nots. So, although I've spent some time in the past talking about how the division between Romanticism and Victorianism is in some ways arbitrary, I'm going to be talking in this video about exactly how different the Victorian period is from the Romanticism or from Modernism, which came after it, and what its distinctive characteristics are. I've been saying all along that the dates we use to demarcate literary periods are somewhat arbitrary and artificial, and even misleading, because they lead us to believe that people went to bed one night as romantics and woke up the next morning feeling very Victorian, and that's clearly not true. Big social and ideological shifts don't necessarily happen overnight. But the dates we use to demarcate the Victorian period are associated with significant political events, which, even if they didn't cause by themselves big social changes, certainly marked significant social movements which altered Victorian society and made it significantly different than the Romantic period. By the same token, the Edwardians very much self-consciously rejected Victorian values and the behaviors of their ancestors. So there really is, to some extent, a real change marked by these dates. The period itself runs from 1832, the date of the passage of the First Reform Bill, to 1901, with the death of Queen Victoria. It begins in 1832, even though Queen Victoria herself doesn't come to the throne in 1837, because the First Reform Bill marked a significant political change in English society and ushered in what was really a new political, social, and ideological era. The period itself is divided into three distinct subcategories, each with its own characteristics. Now, these subcategories have very complex and arcane names, and so you're going to need to note them down carefully so that you don't forget them. The first period, running from 1832 to 1846, the date of the repeal of the so-called Corn Laws, is known as the Early Victorian period. That is followed from 1846 to 1869, the date of the passage of the Second Reform Bill, as the Mid-Victorian period. And the period that runs from 1869 through 1901 is, ready for it, the Late Victorian period. Now, each of these periods has its own very specific set of characteristics. The Early Victorian period is introduced by the passage of the First Reform Bill in 1832. Now, the First Reform Bill was a significant political event because it helped England avert the popular revolution that the English had been fearing now for 40 years, the kind of revolution that had torn apart France. There was tremendous political and social unrest during the Romantic period, as we have seen, and many people were convinced that this would actually lead to a popular revolution. But the passage of the first Reform Bill restructured English government in such a way that it gave a significantly larger group of people control over English government, which helped avert the kinds of revolution people feared. Now, by no means did the poor gain any kind of political power. They were still disenfranchised, but a much larger portion of the middle class, extending down even to the lower reaches of the middle class, gained the vote as a result. Now, the first Reform Bill had two significant effects. The first one was that it extended the franchise, extended the right to vote to what were known as 10-pound householders. That is, men who either owned property, had a freehold on a property, or a long-term lease on a property that was worth 10 pounds of income per year. These people now gained the right to vote. England, before it, had stretched across its various political districts a variety of different kinds of laws allowing people to vote, many of which were extremely restrictive. And this created a uniform law across all of England. It also eliminated what were known as rotten and pocket boroughs. A rotten borough was a depopulated political district. The boroughs are political districts. The political districts in England had been established in the time of Queen Elizabeth, but many changes had taken place since Elizabeth's time, and most recently those changes had to do with the shifts in population as a result of industrialism and enclosure, which we talked about before when we talked about the Romantic period. The shift from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy and the resulting political acts of enclosure caused many people to move to the cities and left many traditionally populous villages empty, but those villages still had votes in Parliament. Now, as I'm sure you know, Parliament is made up of two houses. There is the House of Lords, which is made up of the peers, they're aristocrats, and their possession of a seat in the House is ancestral. And then there's the House of Commons, which represents the people. Traditionally in England, in feudal aristocratic society, possession of land was possession of power, and rotten boroughs allowed an extension of that process. Because there were no people in rotten boroughs, the lord of the manor, the aristocrat who possessed the land on which the village had been built, still had complete control of the votes in that village. So it gave the aristocrats essentially control over the House of Commons. Pocket boroughs were places where the lord of the manor, the aristocrat ruling the area, essentially bought or influenced through power the votes of the people within it. The result of this was the aristocracy had control of all of the government, that the House of Commons became essentially a rubber stamp for the aristocracy. In 1831, for example, of 406 parliamentary districts, 152 were chosen by fewer than 100 votes, and 88 were chosen by fewer than 50 votes, which meant that relatively few people were controlling a very large chunk of Parliament. With the passage of the first Reform Bill, however, the House of Commons, for the first time, actually represented much more effectively and much more accurately the interests of the middle class. And that led to a significant change in English society. The result of the passage of the first Reform Bill was relative political stability during this period. However, that stability is really only relative when compared with the social unrest and threat of revolution that had marked the Romantic period. Even though there was relative political stability, there still was a great deal of social unrest during this period, and a lot of it could be traced to poverty and economic deprivation. In fact, the later part of the period was known as the Hungry 40s. One of the reasons for that was that food was still very expensive, and even basic staples were out of the economic reach of the poor. And in fact, in Ireland during this period, there were several potato blights, which led to widespread famine and the death of thousands of people from starvation. Potato blight is a mildew that infects potatoes and destroys the plants, and potatoes are a staple crop for the Irish population, and the loss of that crop led to widespread hunger and starvation. Obviously, hungry people are also angry, and so there was a tremendous amount of social unrest still taking place during this time. There were riots and gatherings of angry mobs campaigning for social change during this period. However, to some extent, much of this unrest was alleviated in 1846 by the repeal of the Corn Laws. In England, corn is a generic term to refer to grain, and the Corn Laws had been enacted in order to protect English farmers from imports of relatively cheaper grain from abroad. At this particular point in history, England is competing with American farmers, or at least England saw its farmers competing with American farmers. American farmers had land and resources beyond the reach of the average English farmer because America is so much bigger and had the huge plains on which it could grow grain. And the concern is that American farmers would be able to flood the English market with grain and destroy the English economy by driving its farmers out of business. Protective tariffs were enacted in order to avoid this problem. When the tariffs were repealed, exactly the opposite happened in England. All of a sudden, grain was relatively cheap, and many different kinds of food sources depend upon grain. Grain is used not only to make bread, obviously, but also to feed livestock, and not unimportantly, to make beer. And so when grain became relatively cheap, the price of food fell all of a sudden fairly precipitously, and food was now in relatively easy reach of most of the poor population, which pacified a lot of the unrest that had taken place in the previous period. So the repeal of the Corn Laws introduced a period of relative social, political, and economic stability. As a result of the growing economic prosperity and the economic stability for the middle classes, England experienced a period often called Victorian Noon, during which society was relatively peaceful and there was relatively little unrest, which contributed to a tremendous amount of social stability. The growth of the power of the middle class, the growth of the economic and political power of the middle class, led to a proliferation of middle class values, which Charles Dickens famously parodied in his novel Our Mutual Friend by his description of Podsnappery, which we will look at later. It also led to flourishing confidence among the population about various aspects of English society, including industry, including the empire. English industry was seen to be the basis of English prosperity, and it was seen as limitless, so that this prosperity would only expand in the future. The British Empire, as we will see later, covered the globe, and certainly England was the predominant political and economic power on the globe at the time, which made the average English person quite confident in the power and stability of their country. Of course, during this relative period of peace and social stability, the arts and science both had room to expand and develop. And we saw a growth in literature assisted by the tremendous growth in general literacy levels, which is unparalleled in English history. The number of novels that were published in 1848 to 1852 alone, which are now regarded as classics, is astounding. During the period from 1869 to 1801, however, there were other changes. 1869 is the date of the passage of the Second Reform Bill, which extended the franchise to male householders. Any male who possessed a home essentially could vote at this point, which extended the vote well into the laboring class. And the laboring class was to some extent necessarily dissatisfied with the organization of English society. That produced a certain amount of political change as the labor gained power in politics. Also, there were other kinds of doubts being cast upon received beliefs. Things that people had believed in for generations were now coming under question. There was, of course, the question of social justice. Might makes right was no longer an accepted, especially with the growth of power in the working classes, a received dictum. And so there was a lot of doubt about the justice of society and quite a few attempts to change it. Religious faith came under doubt too, as we will see later, as new scientific and social developments caused people to shift their basis of religious belief or abandon it altogether. And then the empire itself began to be questioned as various political events around the globe began to cost England and cost the lives of young English men in warfare. The average English person did not understand. English society was often discussed under the term the spirit of the age. It was a received belief among political thinkers, social writers, and the general population that Victorian society was somehow significantly different from the society that had preceded it. And this was often described as the spirit of the age. And the spirit of the age had certain very specific characteristics. The Victorian period was characterized by the expansion of middle-class values. Traditionally in English society, the value system had been dictated by the aristocracy, by the social elite. They were the people who determined what was seen as appropriate, what was seen as right, what was seen as illegal, and what was seen as inappropriate and what was punishable. During the Victorian period, with the growth of the middle class values also expanded and took over society. And there are several different categories within which these new middle class values, or these expanded middle class values, fell. The first one is the notion of earnestness, or what Matthew Arnold called in The Function of Criticism at the Present Time in Culture and Anarchy, high seriousness. Earnestness is so completely associated with Victorian values that Oscar Wilde, lampooning the Victorian society, wrote a rather famous play called The Importance of Being Earnest. And of course, the joke is the main character's name is Ernest, but he in no way displays Victorian earnestness. Earnestness was seen as taking serious matters seriously and approaching them with enthusiasm and passion. Earnestness or seriousness doesn't necessarily mean somberness.
The Victorians love a good joke, and comedy is an important part of both their culture and their art.
But it does mean that one pursues important matters with energy and dedicates themselves to some significant act or some significant movement that will benefit society in some way. One must always be earnest. One must always be willing to invest oneself in some activity. Of course, one of the activities in which Victorians were expected to invest themselves is work. Industriousness and work were seen as important qualities for Victorian people. As Thomas Carlyle says in Sartor Resartus, and these passages appear on pages 52 and 53 of the Norton Anthology, "Do the duty which lies nearest thee, which thou knowest to be a duty, thy second duty will already have become clearer." And on the next page he says, "Be no longer a chaos but a world, or even a worldkin. Produce, were it but the pitifulest infinitesimal fraction of a product, produce it in God's name. 'Tis the utmost thou hast in thee, out with it then. Up, whatsoever thy hand findeth to do, do it with thy whole might. Work while it is called today, for the night cometh, wherein no man can work." So obviously it was very important that one displayed one's earnestness through work, through doing one's duty. And for example, in Charles Dickens' novel Bleak House, the main character, one of the main characters and one of the two narrators, Esther Summerson, continually talks about the importance of doing her duty among those people who surround her. That's her most important value. So Esther Summerson is appropriately earnest and appropriately serious and appropriately focused on work and duty. Of course, the result of doing all of this work is a growth in material wealth. Material wealth was seen as a physical symbol of your spiritual commitment to work and duty. One of the corollaries of this dictate that one do one's duty and that one works is that those people who do their duty are rewarded with material wealth. The wealthy must be virtuous. Their wealth is a sign of their virtue. And of course, the other side of this is that the poor are obviously not only deprived, but depraved. The poor are being appropriately punished for their lack of appropriate earnestness, their lack of industriousness, and their unwillingness to work. And unfortunately, we still see that attitude permeating modern society. Poor people are blamed for their poverty because obviously it's their fault. If they could only work hard enough, they would be able to make the money that would give them the material wealth that would help them rise in society. That was a common belief in the Victorian era. The poor people were responsible for their poverty. The other side of duty, of course, is the idea of domesticity. The hearth and home was an Englishman's castle. And the Englishman's castle, of course, also contained its angel. The angel of the hearth, as she was called in Coventry Patmore's fairly famous poetry celebrating women's role of subordinate subserviousness. The domestic realm, of course, led to rigid and carefully subscribed gender roles and behavior, therefore. Men were expected to engage in work and politics outside the home. These were not seen as appropriate avenues for female endeavors. Women were supposed to confine their efforts inside the home. And of course, because men going outside the home to work in industry and in politics were necessarily polluted, this, by the way, is an outgrowth of romantic ideology, by the behaviors of people in society. It was necessary for a man to come home and regain his moral purity from the woman in the house, the angel in the hearth, who was expected to be absolutely pure.
Absolutely self-sacrificing.
And as Virginia Woolf fairly hilariously parodies this whole notion in her essay, The Angel in the House, a woman was expected to have no mind or wish of her own, but to always subordinate herself to the minds and wishes of the husband to whom she owed her duty. And so gender roles were very carefully subscribed. What was appropriate for the woman was simply those things related to household and domesticity, and a woman's behavior must never threaten the sanctity of that abode, because men relied on their women to regain their purity when they returned from work. This, of course, was carried out in the notions of respectability, propriety, and conformity. Material wealth and domesticity came together to produce the idea of what it meant to be respectable and proper, and to conform to those ideals. And we see Mill talking about the problems of conformity, which are enforced by what he calls a rigid censorship. One must be respectable, and one must always follow the rules of propriety. As Charles Dickens parodies it in his description of Podsnappery in Our Mutual Friend, one must never engage in behavior or speech which would bring a blush to the cheek of a young person. But of course, in Dickens' parody, a young person was so prone to blush for no reason whatsoever that almost nothing could be said without bringing the said blush and violating Victorian propriety.
In Our Mutual Friend, in the person of Mr. Podsnap, Dickens parodies propriety and respectability, but also the notion of British insularity. Mr. Podsnap is a representative of the middle-class, self-satisfied British man. Mr. Podsnap was well-to-do and stood very high in Mr. Podsnap's opinion. Beginning with a good inheritance, he had married a good inheritance and had thriven exceedingly in the marine insurance way and was quite satisfied. He could never make out why everybody was not quite satisfied, and he felt conscious that he set a brilliant social example in being particularly well satisfied with most things, and above all other things, with himself. Thus happily acquainted with his own merit and importance, Mr. Podsnap settled that whatever he put behind him, he put out of existence. There was a dignified conclusiveness, not to add a grand convenience, in this way of getting rid of disagreeables, which had done much toward establishing Mr. Podsnap in his lofty place in Mr. Podsnap's satisfaction. I don't know about it. I don't choose to discuss it. I don't admit it. Mr. Podsnap had even acquired a peculiar flourish of his right arm, and often clearing the world of its most difficult problems by sweeping them behind him, and consequently sheer away, with those words and a flushed face, for they affronted him. Mr. Podsnap's world was not a very large world morally, no, nor even geographically, seeing that although his business was sustained upon commerce with other countries, he considered other countries, with that important reservation, a mistake, and of their manners and customs he would conclusively observe, "Not English," when, presto, with a flourish of the arm and a flush of the face, they were swept away. Elsewhere the world got up at 8, shaved close at 7:15, breakfasted at 9, and went to the city at 10, came home at 5:30, and dined at 7. Mr. Podsnap's notion of the arts and their integrity might have been stated thus: literature, large print, respectfully descriptive of getting up at 8, shaving close at 1/4 past, breakfasting at 9, going to the city at 10, coming home at 5:30, and dining at 7. Painting and sculpture, models and portraits representing professors of getting up at 8, shaving close at 1/4 past, breakfasting at 9, going to the city at 10, coming home at 5:30, and dining at 7. Music, a respectable performance without variations on stringed and wind instruments, sedately expressive of getting up at 8, shaving close at 1/4 past, breakfasting at 9, going to the city at 10, coming home at 5:30, and dining at 7. Nothing else to be permitted to those same vagrants the arts on pain of excommunication, nothing else to be anywhere. As a so eminently respectable man, Mr. Podsnap was sensible of its being required of him to take Providence under his protection. Consequently, he always knew exactly what Providence meant. Inferior and less respectable men might fall short of that mark, but Mr. Podsnap was always up to it. And it was very remarkable, and must have been very comfortable, that what Providence meant was invariably what Mr. Podsnap meant. These may be said to have been the articles of faith in school, which the present chapter takes the liberty of calling, after its representative man, Podsnappery. They were confined within close bounds, as Mr. Podsnap's own head was confined by his shirt collar, and they were enunciated with a sounding pomp that smacked of the creaking of Mr. Podsnap's own boots. A certain institution in Mr. Podsnap's mind, which he called the young person, may be considered to have been embodied in Miss Podsnap, his daughter. It was an inconvenient and exacting institution, as requiring everything in the universe to be filed down and fitted to it. The question about everything was, would it bring a blush into the cheek of the young person? And the inconvenience of the young person was, that according to Mr. Podsnap, she seemed always liable to burst out into blushes when there was no need at all. There appeared to be no line of demarcation between the young person's excessive innocence and another person's guiltiest knowledge. Take Mr. Podsnap's word for it, and the soberest tints of drab, white, lilac, and gray were all flaming red to this troublesome bull of a young person. This concern for propriety and morality extended into other realms of behavior as well, particularly into sexuality, and especially into feminine sexuality. Now, the Victorians are famous for their Puritanism. There is a oft-repeated and probably apocryphal story about Queen Elizabeth, but the fact that it is so often repeated means that it has some social symbolic significance, even if it isn't true. Queen Victoria, who had many children, was once asked by a young lady how she should behave on her wedding night when her husband would certainly want to gratify his lusts. And Queen Victoria is reported to have said, "Young woman, I lie back and think of England." So women were not expected to experience sexual desire, and certainly never expected to act upon it. Now, the problem was, of course, that young men were not only allowed to act upon sexual desire, they were expected to act upon it. A young gentleman was taken on something called the Grand Tour when he finished school. And an older relative, most likely, would take a young gentleman as he was going out into the world on a tour of the continents and expose him to culture. And so they would go to the museums and they would go see all the great landmarks, and they'd go see the Alps and the Spanish Steps and the Colosseum and Vienna and Paris. But they would also, on that tour, be expected to visit the great brothels of Europe and, quote-unquote, sow their wild oats, so they could come back to England and settle down in respectable propriety. But a young woman who was even suspected of sexual impropriety would be called, and this is the term they used, ruined. And she would literally be ruined, in that she could expect no marriage proposal. No respectable man would propose marriage to a woman of soiled reputation. She could find no other form of livelihood, because for a gentlewoman, the only acceptable forms of livelihood would be working as a governess or a teacher. And of course, no family and no school would hire a woman whose reputation was questionable. And she could not expect to be even supported by her parents, who, in order to preserve their own propriety, are likely to throw her off. And so her only avenues for survival at that point were most likely prostitution, which would obviously lead to an early death if she did not ultimately just commit suicide. And the number of prostitutes in England was significant in the middle of the 19th century. We actually saw Blake address this already in London, his poem From Songs of Experience, but it's a problem throughout the Victorian period. The spirit of the age in England during this period also incorporated a tremendous amount of booming confidence, which resulted from the extraordinary growth in industry and business during this period. Part of that was the result of laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire, if you remember, means let alone, which avoids government regulation of business. And the lack of any government regulation meant that pretty much anything was available, anything was open, and business and industry boomed at unprecedented rates, resulting in the tremendous growth of material wealth. Industrialism and manufacturing was creating tremendous confidence in English society, which was demonstrated by Prince Albert's Great Exhibition of 1851 with the construction of his Crystal Palace, which has been removed but reconstructed in another part of England at this point. But the Great Exhibition was an early form of the World's Fair where manufacturers from across Europe were invited to bring their inventions to this great exhibition in London and show off the progress in science and industry, which not only reflected but promoted this confidence in England's industrial and manufacturing power. Of course, along with industrialism and manufacturing came urbanization, as new industrial centers attracted industry and workers and created large new cities where before had only been sleepy villages like Manchester and Birmingham. It also created the growth of what we now call the service economy. Large groups of people who, rather than working directly in manufacturing, work to advance manufacturing interests or to organize. And the idea of mid-level management is created and expands exponentially. So there are a tremendous number of people now who are making their living as clerks, serving in industry, not as leaders or as workers, but making sure that they're able to facilitate the logistics and manufacturing and storing and sales and marketing of products. And so there's a whole new service economy and also the resulting expansion of wealth from that service economy to the workers who are now taking home a tremendous amount of money and being able to spend it on a new growth of goods produced by this manufacturing. And this led, of course, to the growth of the wealth of the middle class. The middle class now is larger and wealthier and able to invest its money in ways including not only material possessions and elaborate fancy homes, but also on travel and education, resulting in a larger, more well-informed and politically powerful middle class. Because they needed to travel and because industry needed to be able to move its raw materials and goods around, they needed a modern form of transportation. And the railroads were developed in order to move goods quickly around England, resulting in a massive change in English society in a variety of ways. One of the ways is that the traditional methods of travel were by the horse-drawn or the ox-drawn cart, which is very slow and requires a day to move 20 to 40 miles, depending upon the kind of way you're traveling, if you're traveling by cart or by post. With trains, however, now one could leave Edinburgh and be back in London within a day, which before would have been a several days journey, which most people would not have the time or money to take. So now people were easily able to travel across England, which not only made remote areas accessible, allowed for the movement of raw materials and products across England, but also allowed for a tremendous amount of travel for the newly enriched middle class, and also allowed for the rapid communication of information from one part of England to the other. Along with all of this tremendous growth in industry, of course, became an attitude generally of tremendous confidence in England, the empire, and the future. It has often been said that the sun never sets on the British Empire, and at this point in history, it is literally true. England encompasses the globe. It is the center of political, economic, and military might across the globe. The British Empire covers India, the second most populous country in the world, Canada, Australia, parts of Africa, parts of Central and South America, and parts of Asia. This map reflects in pink all of the different parts of the world which at one point or another have been part of the British Empire. And although during the Victorian period, obviously some of them are no longer part of Great Britain, including the 13 colonies, many of the parts of Africa, Jamaica, Canada, Australia, India, parts of the Middle East, and Hong Kong are still parts of England. So England controls a significant portion of the landscape in the world at this particular point in history. As a result of this empire and colonialism, there's tremendous economic growth, not only from England's own industry, of course, which relies on raw materials imported from the colonies, but also from the amount of wealth that they're able to extract from their colonies, and especially from India. India is a significant source of England's wealth. Because of all of this economic growth, because of its tremendous economic and political and military power, England enjoys during this period, especially during the Victorian noon period from 1846 through 1869, 1870, a tremendous amount of social stability and domestic peace. And when one can feel comfortable and confident walking across the street in the dead of night in London because of the newly available protections of the police, among other things, one can feel very confident that their country is reaching the pinnacle of human development, as was often said by the English about their country. Also, there's political freedom. England, for many, many years, had been laboring under a variety of different kinds of repressive measures, stamp acts and taxes which limited free expression and freedom of the press, freedom of publication, the suspension of habeas corpus as a result of the fears of revolution. And during this particular period of time, there was relative political and religious freedom in England for the first time in many centuries, and the English were perfectly aware of this. As a result of this, the English engaged in a philosophy or a belief system that is described as positivism. Positivism is the belief that humans and human society are constantly developing and ultimately headed for perfection. And for many in England at this time, and even for some fairly prominent writers like Thomas Babington Macaulay, England and the English have reached the pinnacle of human development. They're almost at the point of knowing in science all there is to be known. They have reached the perfection of government. They've reached the epitome of artistic achievement. And this is actually commonly repeated in the press and among citizens of England who celebrated their superiority to the whole rest of the world. And so when we see the English engaging in Eurocentric behavior, it's not necessarily just a result of their Eurocentric white privilege. It's also based upon their belief that they have more or less conquered all the known parts of the world and therefore have demonstrated their superiority over the other poor benighted races and countries that have not managed to achieve such wondrous superiority. Of course, the other side of this extraordinary sense of superiority is the notion of patronage, the idea that one who is so superior owes it to those deprived, less fortunate people to help lift them from their depraved ways of life. And this extends not only to what Rudyard Kipling famously called the white man's burden, helping those other races out of their benighted backwardness, but it also extends to those depraved members of one's own society. And so England during this period really engaged in what we can call the Age of Reform. There were reform movements everywhere. It was often addressed by what was known as the Condition of England question, and problems of poverty, crime, illness, ignorance, and abuse were dealt with by all sorts of societies of volunteers working for the betterment of others. In Dickens' novel Bleak House, he parodies this obsessive idea of helping others to the extent even of neglecting one's own duty in Miss Pardiggle, who is constantly raising funds for some movement or other to do something silly for someone somewhere else, while her own household falls to pieces. And of course, Bleak House has Esther Summerson, who's celebrated for her notion of doing one's duty to those around one. This idea of reform addresses the problems of England in a variety of different ways. England, of course, as we mentioned during our discussion of the Romantic period, especially in the larger cities, London, Birmingham, Manchester, had horrific slums, places where sewage ran down the middle of the streets. Dead animals would lie in the streets. Homes would collapse because of the lack of any kind of building codes. Illness was rampant. The stench was horrific. And of course, along with all of these problems of sanitation came problems of disease. London was regularly swept with typhoid epidemics, killing thousands of people at a time. And a lot of this was coming from the fact that they did not have a proper infrastructure, and the common wells that were used to provide drinking water were being contaminated by the sewage, which was being disposed of right next to them. And so there was a big public health movement at this time, trying to eliminate the causes of disease and clean up the slums. Part of the elimination of the slums also was an unintended byproduct of the buildings of the railroads, because railroads required a lot of landscape, and the most easily available land was, of course, that occupied by the poor. It could be had most easily for the least amount of money, and so whole neighborhoods were razed in order to make room for the railway in London. Dickens also records this, by the way, in Our Mutual Friend, when he describes a neighborhood that has been totally transformed by the coming of the railroad. Of course, there are also problems of crime, because poverty is often accompanied by crime. And so modern law enforcement is another reform, and the London Metropolitan Police is the first recorded organized modern police force, and it was founded in 1829. Dickens also was obsessed with the police force and would often follow police officers on their nightly rounds and features police officers in some of his novels. And in fact, is credited with recording the first traditional British detective in English fiction, the forerunner of Sherlock Holmes, who is Mr. Bucket in Bleak House. There's also a tremendous agitation over working conditions. Suddenly people seem to notice that children, for instance, were being employed in factories and were being injured and being killed or dying of disease at tremendous rates. And so there were movements to limit working hours. There was a Sabbatarian movement which was agitating to allow workers the day off on Sunday. Traditionally, workers worked a half day on Sunday so they could go to church in the morning. And this was actually a very divisive issue, because on the one hand, the goal was to give leisure to workers, but on the other hand, workers themselves objected to it because they were going to lose a half day of very necessary income. And then child labor was another problem. As we mentioned when we talked about Blake and we talked about the origins of chimney sweepers, social movements tend to fall behind social developments, and agrarian societies need to produce lots of children to work farms in order to ensure that their parents have something to fall back on when they become old and disabled, and they rely upon their children to provide for them. However, in an industrial society, excess children are a problem. One has to feed them. But also, there are no laws that prevent children from working in factories. And at least until the middle of the 18th century, such laws were not enacted. In fact, laissez-faire economics, which opposed any kind of government regulation of business, opposed it. And so it took quite a while for them to enact laws that protected child labor. Education was also a big area of reform, primarily education of the lower classes. In a traditional agrarian society, literacy and anything more than a very basic education in one's catechism was unnecessary for working on a farm. But in an industrial society, people need to be able to read. And so there was a movement towards general education over the course of the 19th century, which finally established in the latter part of the 19th century pretty much universal literacy across England. And the movement was facilitated not only by the sense that it would be useful to have poor people be able to read, but also that it would be useful to have them educated so that they understood the goals and purpose of civilized society and wouldn't disrupt it. Education was often seen as a means of preventing revolution. And many movements established what were known as ragged schools. Ragged schools were free schools for the children of the poor, where they could learn basic literacy as well as basic self-control and respect for the legal system. Of course, the 19th century also saw the rise of the women's suffrage movement and the movement to give women the right to vote. And although that movement wasn't successful in England until 1921, there are many people, including John Stuart Mill and Harriet Martineau, writing in favor of gaining legal and political rights for women. Finally, the British legal system was desperately in need of reform. The basic structure of the British legal system had been established during Queen Elizabeth's time and the Restoration, and by the 19th century was wholly inadequate to handle the legal problems of a modern industrial society. Dickens, once again in Bleak House, campaigns against the inefficiencies of the British legal system and the tremendous cost that could come from becoming involved in the legal system when he describes the suit of Jarndyce versus Jarndyce. Jarndyce versus Jarndyce is a suit handled in the Court of Chancery, which is essentially their version of a family law court, in which two members of a family are suing over an inheritance. And gradually the case expands to the point where people are being pulled into the case against their will, and they have to retain counsel. They have no choice, and are finally ruined by a case in which they have no real interest. And the case itself goes on for 80 years, to the point that no one even remembers what the original case was about, and is finally ended only when the entire estate is eaten up in legal costs and there is no finding. There's simply nothing left to adjudicate at the end of the case. And so Jarndyce and Jarndyce is finally given up. The other side of England's tremendous confidence is that it also becomes, somewhat paradoxically, the age of doubt, especially in the latter part of the Victorian period after 1870. One of the areas in which there was a tremendous amount of doubt expressed was the area of religious belief. In 1851, a religious census, and by the way, the Victorian period is the period where there is the growth of the social sciences and of anthropology, which was accompanied by a desire to study populations. And a census in 1851 revealed that out of roughly 18 million people in England and Wales, 7.2 million people, which is 40% of the population, did not regularly go to church. Now, this was seen as a sign of the tremendous irreligion of English society, and that English society was falling apart at the seams. But it also indicated something sociologically, which is that religious belief no longer functioned in the way it had before. Number one, as people's method of interpreting and understanding the cosmos, but also a method of ensuring social order. And a variety of different means were proposed by various different people, including Carlyle and Matthew Arnold, in order to remedy this loss, finding a substitute for it. Matthew Arnold substitutes culture. Thomas Carlyle substitutes work and duty. But religious belief is coming under attack from a variety of different directions. One is from science. Sir Charles Lyell, a famous British geologist, is interpreting the geologic record, and during excavations they're finding the skeletons of dinosaurs, and the geologic record demonstrates these dinosaurs, which are not recorded in the Bible, lived long before the period of time that the Bible records, apparently lived before the dawn of history, before the creation of the planet, according to the traditional biblical beliefs, which contradicted what had been the received beliefs taught by the Bible. So geology is challenging the literal truth of the Bible. Along with that, astronomy is revealing the structure of the universe in ways that undermine the notion that the Earth can possibly be the center of all things. The geocentric model of the universe had been replaced by a heliocentric model with Copernicus and Galileo, but it wasn't until the end of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century that astronomers began to realize that the sun was not at the center of the universe and was in fact a very small part of a very much larger cosmos. The Earth is now being relegated to a relatively distant part of a much larger cosmos than was originally believed, reducing its significance and undermining the belief in the anointed sphere of the Earth as the center of the universe. At the same time, physics is revealing new laws of behavior that don't rely on mystical or superstitious ways of explaining the universe. And so what was once seen as the will of a deity is now becoming seen as the result of the processes of natural law. And all of these influences are now beginning to undermine the influence of traditional religious belief. Further, the growth of sociology and the social sciences and the creation of anthropology is also creating attitudes which question the very nature of belief. On the continent, and particularly in Germany, something called the higher criticism is beginning to examine sacred texts, not as evidence of God's rule, but rather as documents showing anthropological history. They're no longer regarding these texts as sacred texts which give us laws for behavior, but now seeing them as historical evidence that needs to be interpreted and understood. And when you subject a sacred text to scientific inquiry, it necessarily, to some extent, reduces the status of that sacred text as an unquestionable source of law. The value of the empire is being questioned as well. We'll see this, in fact, in texts like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, where the question of the right of English to impose their will on other continents comes up, and the effect of that on those people who are subject to colonialism. But the average English person at this particular time is also beginning to wonder, because England experienced two very expensive and damaging wars. The Crimean War, which is famous because of Tennyson's poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, in which into the Valley of Death rode the 600, commemorating a battle in which English soldiers mounted on horses confronted more or less modern artillery and were basically wiped out. And the Boer War in South Africa, in which Dutch-German settlers fought back against the English rulers of the area in a very expensive and damaging war and engaged in guerrilla warfare that essentially wiped out the British soldiers stationed in South Africa. And the fact that the English were sending off their young men to die in places that the average English person had never heard of for reasons the average English person could not understand, threw into question the validity and importance of maintaining an empire. And then finally, the issue of positivism and the perfection of humanity. The loss of faith in the empire and the destruction waged through the Crimean War and the Boer War and other activities around the globe caused many people to start to question whether humans actually were reaching perfection, or whether English society was actually the pinnacle of human achievement. And so for many of these people, this notion that humans were eventually going to establish perfection became thrown into question and was ultimately killed by World War I and levels of destruction, not only of soldiers, but of civilians that had never before been seen in human history.
Next, we're going to be looking at the philosophical divide that separated, but then ultimately and paradoxically unified Victorians around how to help their fellow human beings.